There is a curious moment that many people begin to experience after awakening. It is not a dramatic moment. It does not arrive as a sudden explosion of realization. In fact, it is something much quieter, something subtle, something that can easily go unnoticed at first. But once you recognize it, it begins to change the way you move through life. For most of your life, you were taught to trust certain forms of guidance. Trust logic. Trust opinions. Trust the expectations of the world. Trust what others say is the correct path, and in many ways, this works. Society itself was built upon this structure. From an early age we learn that answers exist outside of us, in books, in teachers, in authorities, in experts, in traditions, in social norms. Everything seems to point in the same direction. If you want to know what to do, ask the world. But something begins to change when consciousness starts to awaken. At first, this change is almost imperceptible. You continue living your life normally, you continue working, you continue having conversations, you continue following your routines, but inside you something begins to move, a feeling, a small perception, a quiet question, that starts appearing in unexpected moments. Perhaps this has already happened to you. You are in a conversation. Everyone seems to agree about something. But inside you, there is a subtle sense that something does not feel entirely true, or perhaps you are about to make an important decision. The logic of the mind says one thing, but a deeper internal sensation points in another direction, and this sensation is curious. It does not shout, it does not demand attention, it does not come with long explanations. It appears as a whisper, something subtle, something that many people ignore for most of their lives, because we were trained to trust thought more than perception, logic more than feeling, analysis more than awareness, and so many people move through life disconnected from this quieter dimension of consciousness. But when awakening begins to unfold, something interesting happens. The mind continues to function, it continues analyzing, it continues interpreting, but it no longer seems to hold the same absolute authority. Before, everything passed through it. Every decision, every interpretation, every direction. Now, something else begins to appear beside it, another way of perceiving, another way of knowing, something that does not rely entirely on thought, something that does not require long narratives in order to exist. Something that simply appears as clarity, and this clarity is fascinating because often it appears before the mind can explain anything. You feel before you understand, you perceive before you conclude, you recognize before you analyze. And this can be extremely confusing at first, because we were taught to believe that knowledge must always come with reasoning, that certainty must always be justified, that every decision must be logically explained. But consciousness works differently. It does not need to prove anything, it simply perceives. Perhaps you have experienced moments like this, moments when you knew something was wrong, long before any evidence appeared, or moments when you felt you should follow a certain path, even though you could not logically explain why, and often, only later, the mind finally catches up with what awareness had already perceived. These moments reveal something fascinating about the nature of consciousness. Perhaps there is a form of intelligence within us that does not depend entirely on thought. A kind of intelligence that recognizes patterns before the mind organizes them. A form of perception that operates through presence, not only through logic. And when this possibility begins to be considered, something important begins to emerge. A question that can transform the way you live your life. What if the mind is not the only source of guidance? What if there is a deeper way of knowing, a form of guidance that arises from awareness itself? At first this idea may feel strange, but many ancient traditions have pointed toward exactly this. For thousands of years, different cultures have spoken about something often described as inner wisdom, the voice of consciousness, deep intuition, inner presence. But in a world dominated by speed and logic, this quiet dimension was gradually forgotten, not because it disappeared, but because we moved away from the space where it can be perceived. And this is where the real journey begins. Because awakening is not only about seeing reality differently, it is also about learning a new way to relate to your own consciousness, a quieter way, a more attentive way, a more present way. And perhaps the most profound shift of all is this: learning to trust what has always been within you. But this raises an important question, because trusting inner awareness is not something we are taught. No one explains how to recognize it. No one shows us how to distinguish real intuition from the noise of the mind. And that is exactly what we will explore throughout this video. Because there is a profound difference between hearing the mind and listening to awareness. And learning to perceive that difference can transform the way you move through life. But before we understand how to trust this inner guidance, we need to understand something even deeper. Why did we become disconnected from it in the first place? If there truly exists within us such a profound form of perception, if there is a silent intelligence capable of guiding us, then an inevitable question arises. Why do most people seem so disconnected from it? Why do so many people go through their entire lives without ever recognizing this inner voice? The answer is not a lack of ability. It is not that some people have this capacity and others do not. In truth, everyone is born with this form of perception. It is part of the natural structure of consciousness. But something happens throughout life, something subtle, something that begins very early in childhood. Imagine a very young child, before learning the rules of the world, before understanding social expectations, before internalizing the logic of external structures. The child perceives reality very differently. She feels before explaining. She senses before concluding. She responds to life with direct sensitivity. If something feels strange, she senses it. If something feels true, she recognizes it. There is a natural connection between perception and experience. But as the child grows, the world begins to teach something very specific. She learns that certain perceptions should be ignored. She learns that certain feelings are not reliable. She learns that thinking is more important than sensing. Gradually, attention begins to move outward. Instead of trusting inner perception, the child learns to seek external validation. What do others say? What is considered correct? What is expected? And slowly, a new structure begins to form. A structure built on adaptation. This structure is often called the ego, but the ego is not necessarily an enemy. It is a tool. It emerges as a way to navigate the social world. It learns rules. It learns behaviors. It learns how to protect itself. It learns how to interpret situations. In many ways, it is necessary. Without it, interacting with the world would be extremely difficult. But there is an important detail. The ego operates mainly through thought. It interprets, it analyzes, it compares. It projects possible futures. And as it grows stronger, the mind begins to dominate the experience of consciousness. Everything starts to be filtered through thinking. Every sensation must be explained. Every perception must be analyzed. Every impulse must be interpreted. And during this process, something quiet begins to happen. The subtle dimension of awareness becomes suppressed. Not because it disappears, but because the noise of the mind becomes constant. It is like trying to hear a whisper in a crowded room full of voices. And so many people spend years, sometimes decades, living almost entirely inside their minds. Thoughts about the past, thoughts about the future, thoughts about what might happen, thoughts about what others think, thoughts about who we should become. The mind creates a continuous narrative, a story about life. And gradually we begin to believe that this story is who we are. But here lies a very important insight. Thought is not consciousness. Thought happens inside consciousness, but they are not the same thing. This distinction is essential for understanding awakening, because awakening often begins when we realize that we are not only the voice of the mind. There is something deeper observing all of it. A silent space, a presence, an awareness that perceives thoughts, without being those thoughts. And when this realization begins to emerge, something interesting happens. The mind loses part of its absolute authority. It continues functioning, but it is no longer the only source of truth. And this is when the quieter dimension of awareness begins to reappear. But here something important must be understood. Reconnecting with this dimension does not mean stopping thinking. It does not mean rejecting the mind. It does not mean abandoning logic. Instead, something more balanced begins to emerge. The mind remains a tool, but it stops being the only guide. Gradually, we begin to notice that something deeper exists behind thought, a form of direct perception, a clarity that does not need to be constructed, something that simply appears. But at this stage of the journey, a new challenge arises, because perceiving inner awareness is one thing, learning to trust it is something entirely different. Many people begin to sense this inner perception. They begin to notice subtle guidance. But at the same time, the mind continues questioning everything. Is this real? Am I imagining this? Am I deceiving myself? Should I trust this feeling? This tension between mind and awareness is a natural part of awakening. For years the mind has been the authority. Now it begins to realize that it is not alone. And this creates friction, a tension between control and trust, between analysis and perception, between logic and awareness. But something even more interesting is unfolding beneath this conflict. Because as you begin to observe this dynamic, a deeper question starts to appear. If there is the voice of the mind, and there is the perception of awareness, how can we distinguish one from the other? There is a very interesting moment that begins to unfold as awakening deepens. A moment when something that was once invisible starts becoming clear. Before this, everything seemed to come from the same place. thoughts, feelings, impulses, decisions, it all seem to belong to the same inner voice. But as awareness deepens, something fascinating begins to emerge. You start noticing that there are different layers within your inner experience. And this realization can be surprising, because for a long time we assumed that the mind and consciousness are the same thing. But in reality, they function very differently. The mind is noisy, it comments on everything, it analyzes, it interprets. The mind rarely remains silent. It functions almost like a radio that never turns off. Even when you are not intentionally thinking about something, thoughts continue to appear, a constant stream of ideas, memories, worries, and interpretations. For many years, we identify completely with this flow. We believe we are that voice. We believe we are those thoughts. But when awakening begins, something changes. You start noticing that there is something observing those thoughts, something present before they appear, something still present after they disappear. That silent presence is what many traditions call awareness, and the more you begin to notice this difference, the clearer it becomes. The mind speaks, awareness perceives, the mind argues, awareness observes, the mind tries to control, awareness simply remains present. This creates a profound shift in the way you experience yourself, because for the first time, you begin to see that not everything that appears inside you needs to be followed. Thoughts can arise without being true, impulses can appear without needing to be acted upon, fears can emerge without representing real danger. This realization creates space, a space between awareness and the content of the mind. And inside that space something very interesting begins to appear, clarity. But there is an important detail here. Inner awareness does not express itself in the same way the mind does. The mind speaks in sentences, it builds arguments, it explains, it debates, it tries to convince. Inner awareness rarely functions like that. Most of the time it appears as a quiet sense of clarity, something that does not require many words. Perhaps you have experienced this before, a moment when you simply knew something was true, even though you could not explain why. Or a moment when you sensed that a certain path was not aligned with who you truly are, even if every external reason suggested the opposite. This type of perception does not come from the mind. It comes from a deeper layer of consciousness. But here is the interesting part. At first it can be difficult to distinguish this perception from the voice of the mind. The mind can also sound convincing. It can also appear logical. It can present strong arguments. So how can we tell the difference? This question becomes extremely important in the awakening process. And over time, many people begin to notice certain signals that help distinguish one from the other. One of the first signals is the tone of the experience. The mind usually carries tension, urgency, anxiety, pressure. It creates the feeling that something must be resolved immediately. It insists, it pushes, it tries to convince you. Inner awareness works very differently. It does not pressure, it does not demand, it does not try to convince you. It simply reveals a calm clarity. Even when it points towards something challenging, there is still a sense of quiet calm behind it. Another signal is simplicity. The mind loves complexity. It creates long narratives, detailed explanations, endless justifications. Inner awareness, on the other hand, is usually extremely simple. Sometimes it appears only as a subtle feeling of alignment, or misalignment, a quiet sense that something is in harmony, or that something is not, without needing long explanations. But perhaps the most fascinating signal of all is this. Inner awareness does not arise from fear. It arises from presence. Even when it suggests difficult changes, it does not carry the energy of fear. It carries something else, a quiet truth, something you recognize, even if you cannot fully explain it. And the more you begin to recognize these signals, the more something interesting happens. You start identifying this inner dimension more easily, but this leads to an even deeper question. Because recognizing inner awareness is only the first step. The real challenge comes afterward, when the moment arrives to act. Because sensing something within you is one thing, trusting that perception, especially when it conflicts with the external world, is something entirely different. And this is exactly where many people encounter the greatest challenge of awakening, because trusting inner awareness often means walking without guarantees, without external validation, without immediate explanations, and that can be frightening. But there is something many people begin to discover through this process, something that transforms the way they live. Because the more you learn to recognize inner awareness, the more a deeper question begins to emerge. What if this silent guidance has always been present, waiting only for you to learn how to listen? There is something very curious about inner awareness. It rarely appears when we are trying to force it. In fact, it often emerges in moments when the mind finally slows down. Perhaps you have experienced something like this before. A moment when you were walking alone, or looking at the horizon, or sitting quietly without doing anything specific, and suddenly, something becomes clear. Not as a logical conclusion, not as the result of reasoning, but as a direct perception, a sense that something simply makes sense. Experiences like this happen far more often than we realize. But there is an important detail. For most of our lives, we were taught to distrust this type of perception because the modern world values primarily what can be explained, what can be measured, what can be demonstrated. And naturally, these things are valuable. Science, logic, and analysis have brought tremendous progress to humanity. But there is another side of human experience that does not function purely through logic. A dimension that operates through direct perception, through sensitivity, through awareness. And when we observe the history of humanity, something interesting becomes clear. Many of the greatest insights did not arise purely from logical analysis. They emerged from deep intuition. Albert Einstein, for example, often spoke about the role of intuition in his discoveries. He once said something fascinating, that the analytical mind is a faithful servant, but the intuitive mind is a sacred gift. And according to him, modern society had learned to honor the servant while completely forgetting the gift. This observation reveals something profound. The problem is not the mind. The problem is imbalance. For a long time, we learned to trust only analytical thinking, but we ignored the intelligence of perception. And this imbalance creates something interesting. The more we try to control life entirely through the mind, the more disconnected we become from our inner awareness. And this creates a very common feeling in modern life, a feeling of disconnection. Many people feel like they are doing everything correctly, following the expected path, making decisions that seem rational, and yet, something feels missing. There is a subtle feeling of misalignment, as if life is being lived, but not deeply experienced. This sensation is often the first signal that something within us is trying to be noticed, not through words, but through perception. Because inner awareness rarely speaks in sentences, it communicates through sensations of alignment. You can feel when something is deeply right, even if you cannot explain why, and you can feel when something is deeply misaligned, even if everyone around you says it makes sense. Perhaps you have experienced moments like this. Moments when you followed logic, and later realized something inside you already knew it was not the right path. Or moments when you trusted a quiet perception, and later discovered it was accurate. These experiences reveal something fascinating. Inner awareness does not function the same way the mind does. The mind works through constructed certainty. Awareness works through direct perception. The mind needs time to analyze. Awareness simply recognizes. But there is something even deeper here. Many people begin to notice that this inner perception becomes clearer when the mind is quiet, when there is space, when there is presence, when there is attention. And this reveals something fundamental about consciousness. Inner awareness does not compete with the noise of the mind. It appears only when there is enough space to perceive it. That is why many ancient traditions emphasized practices such as meditation, silence, observation, presence, not because these practices create awareness, but because they remove the noise that prevents us from perceiving it. And when that noise begins to fade, something very interesting happens. You start noticing that throughout your entire life there were moments when this awareness was already trying to guide you. Moments of clarity, moments of deep perception, moments when something inside you simply knew, but perhaps at that time you did not trust it. Perhaps you ignored it. Perhaps you followed the logic of the world around you instead. And that is completely understandable, because trusting inner awareness requires something we were rarely taught. Courage, the courage to listen to something that does not come with guarantees, the courage to trust a perception that cannot always be explained, the courage to move toward the unknown. But something fascinating begins to happen when people start trusting this guidance. Life begins to reorganize itself, not necessarily in predictable ways, but in deeply aligned ways. Situations begin to make more sense. Decisions become clearer. Relationships become more authentic, and this happens because inner awareness is not trying to satisfy external expectations. It simply points toward what is true. But this raises an important question. If this awareness has always been present, and if it has always tried to guide us, why do so many people still struggle to trust it? There is something very interesting that begins to happen when we start recognizing our inner awareness. At first, everything feels surprisingly clear. You begin noticing small moments of perception. Moments when something inside you simply knows that a certain path feels aligned, knows that a decision does not feel true, knows that something needs to change. These perceptions appear quietly, without pressure, without explanation, without trying to convince you. But soon after this perception appears, something curious happens. The mind enters the scene. It begins questioning, analyzing, doubting, and this creates a very common conflict in the awakening process. On one side, there is a quiet perception. On the other side, there is a mind full of questions. The mind wants proof. It wants explanations. It wants guarantees. It wants to know exactly what will happen if you follow that perception. But inner awareness rarely functions that way. It does not present a full plan. It does not explain every detail. It simply reveals the next step that feels true, and this can be deeply uncomfortable for the mind. Because the mind was trained to seek security. It wants predictability. It wants control. It wants to understand everything before acting. But inner awareness does not attempt to control the future. It is concerned only with what is true in the present moment. And this is where one of the greatest challenges of awakening appears. Learning to trust something that does not offer guarantees. This process can feel frightening. Because throughout life we were taught to trust external structures, trust rules, trust systems, trust authorities, trust familiar paths. But trusting inner awareness means something very different. It means walking without detailed maps. It means following a perception that often reveals only one small step at a time. For many people, that feels risky. The mind immediately starts creating scenarios. What if this is wrong? What if I am deceiving myself? What if I am interpreting things incorrectly? These doubts are natural. They are part of the process. Because the mind is used to being the only authority. Now it begins realizing that something deeper exists. Something that does not depend entirely on it, and this creates resistance. But something fascinating happens when people continue observing this process. Inner awareness does not speak through fear. The mind speaks through fear. It creates scenarios, it creates worries, it imagines problems. Inner awareness functions differently. It does not generate panic. It does not create urgency. It does not create anxiety. It simply reveals a sense of alignment, even when pointing toward difficult changes. Even when suggesting decisions that feel challenging, there is still a sense of calm behind the perception, and this detail is extremely important, because it reveals something fundamental about the nature of awareness. Inner truth rarely appears accompanied by tension. It appears with clarity. But trusting that clarity requires something many people must rediscover: trust in themselves. For a long time many people were taught to doubt their own perception, to trust more in what others say, to trust more in what appears socially acceptable, to trust more in what appears logically correct. But awakening begins to reveal something different. It reveals that there is a dimension of consciousness that does not depend on external validation, a dimension that simply perceives. And when you begin recognizing that dimension, something interesting happens. You start realizing that many of the most important moments in your life were influenced by this silent perception. Perhaps it was the moment you chose a different path. Perhaps it was the moment you realized a relationship was no longer aligned. Perhaps it was the moment you decided to change something fundamental in your life. Many of those decisions did not emerge purely from logic. They emerged from perception, a deep sense of truth. And often, only later, the mind finally understood what that perception had already revealed. These experiences begin to show something fascinating. Inner awareness is not something we need to create. It has always been present. What we need to learn is how to listen again. And this leads us to a very important moment in the journey. Because learning to hear inner awareness is only the beginning. The real step comes when an inevitable question arises. If this silent guidance is real, how can we learn to trust it more deeply? Perhaps the greatest change that happens when we begin trusting inner awareness is not something immediately visible to the world. It does not necessarily appear in external circumstances. It is not always a dramatic change in career, nor is it a sudden transformation in the conditions of life. The deepest shift happens within. It happens quietly in the way we begin relating to the experience of being alive. For a long time, many people spend their lives trying to discover the right path, the correct decision, the direction they should follow. The mind becomes a constant machine of analysis. It compares possibilities. It calculates scenarios. It tries to predict outcomes. It creates strategies to avoid mistakes. And through this process, life often becomes an endless sequence of doubts. But something very interesting begins to happen when we start recognizing inner awareness. Decisions begin to feel simpler. Not necessarily easier, but clearer, because instead of relying only on the logic of the mind, something deeper begins to emerge. A sense of alignment, a quiet sense of truth, a peaceful perception pointing toward what feels authentic in that moment. And when that perception begins to be recognized, something inside us changes profoundly. The need to control every detail begins to fade. The need to predict every outcome begins to lose strength. The need to have all the answers before taking the next step begins to disappear. Because gradually we begin to understand something important. Inner awareness does not demand perfection. It does not require absolute certainty. It does not require that you understand the entire path before you begin walking. It simply invites presence. It invites listening. It invites a different form of trust. A trust that does not arise from the guarantee that everything will work out, but from the perception that there is a quiet intelligence guiding the movement of life. And when this trust begins to emerge, something very interesting happens. Our relationship with the unknown begins to change. Before, the unknown felt threatening, something that needed to be avoided, something that needed to be controlled, something that needed to be understood before being lived. But now it begins to be perceived differently, as open space, as a field of discovery, as a territory where awareness can continue revealing itself. And when this shift happens, something even more fascinating begins to appear. Life becomes more alive, more present, more real. Small decisions begin to carry deeper meaning. Small moments begin to be perceived with greater depth. Simple conversations begin to reveal unexpected layers of truth. Relationships begin to become more authentic, not because the world suddenly changed, but because perception changed. Inner awareness begins to function like a silent compass. It does not force directions. It does not impose paths. It does not create urgency, but it reveals alignment. And the more you learn to recognize that alignment, the more natural it becomes to move forward. But there is something important to understand. Trusting inner awareness does not mean life becomes perfect. Moments of doubt will still appear. Difficult phases will still exist. There will still be situations where the path does not seem entirely clear, but there is a profound difference. Even within uncertainty, a quiet sense of trust begins to emerge. A trust that does not depend on external validation. A trust that does not rely on guarantees. A trust that arises from awareness itself. And perhaps this is one of the greatest transformations of awakening. Realizing that the guidance we were searching for outside has always been within, but this realization leads to one final reflection. When inner awareness begins guiding life, something profound also begins to happen. The old identity begins to transform. The stories we told about who we are begin to lose their power. Roles that once seemed permanent begin to dissolve. Beliefs that once felt solid begin to be questioned. And slowly, something new begins to emerge, a different way of existing, a more conscious way of living, a more direct relationship with experience itself. And this is where many people make a surprising discovery. Awakening is not the end of the journey. In many ways, it is only the beginning. Because when awareness awakens, life does not end in a final conclusion. It opens into a continuous process of discovery. Each day reveals new layers of perception, new ways of understanding ourselves, new ways of relating to existence. And this is exactly what we will explore in the next and final video of this series. Awakening was only the beginning. Awakening was only the beginning. Continue this journey, because awakening is not a destination. It is an ongoing process of awareness. Gratitude for being here. Much light on your path. Quantum silence.